Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm David Gustina, and with us, our very first guest with some breaking news. Yes, it's Blair Horner, the now former executive director of the New York Public Interest Research Group, or NYPIRG. He's now the group's senior policy advisor. You can find out more about NYPIRG at nypirg.org. And in the interest of full disclosure, of course, Blair does commentary for WAMC, where this show is generated, and has served on WAMC's Board of Trustees. Blair, congratulations on this new policy director position from our before coming on air talks. It sounds like it's a good move for you in time.
Yeah, the old Kenny Rogers song, got to know when to hold them, got to know when to fold them. I'm not as young as I used to be, so now's a good time for a transition to somebody young and talented.
Yeah, and that's Megan Ahern, who's going to take over as the new executive director. You know, give folks out there who may not pay so close attention, they know you're NYPIRG. What does this shift mean, and, what is NYPIRG? How's it all fleshing out here?
Well, NYPIRG is a statewide, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that does research and advocacy on a wide range of issues. We've been around now for a little over 50 years. We not only do advocacy at all levels of government, primarily at the state level, but we also run an internship program where college students come to Albany and we train them on how to do lobbying, for example. So in terms of my upcoming role, it'll be for me, in a sense, just to keep going with various artistic connections back to the future. I'll be focused more just on state government and the internship program. We have 5 full-time college students coming to Albany starting on January 7th, and I'll be running sort of all state stuff. And that's what I had done prior to becoming executive director about a decade ago. And so the new person, Megan Ahern, will be sort of taking the reins and running the organization and all of the things that entail with helping to set the organizational direction as well as to, manage and herd the cats.
Yeah, it involves a lot of meetings, I bet.
Well, it's not a big place, but it's not teeny either. There's about 50 full-time staff, and in the summer we do a lot of work in the communities, and that the staff can swell up to maybe 200 staff. So there's a lot of people to deal with and a lot of different departments to sort of manage. And so, there's a lot of work in terms of just sort of running the place. Megan will be the 8th executive director in the 50-plus years of the organization. And so the shelf life is around somewhere close to around a decade. And so my shelf life was up. And as some of your listeners may know, I'm over 70 now. And so it seems like a good time to sort of figure out a transition to someone young and bright as compared to whatever's left of me.
Yeah, sometimes I give the shelf life, but the package is still fresh a little while longer. You're going to stick around, so that's good, But is NYPIRG isolationist? Aren't there other PIRGs out there? Don't you have other affiliations as well?
Well, there are other public interest research groups across the country, Vermont PIRG, Massachusetts PIRG, Connecticut PIRG. They all have their own state-based advocacy groups. And to, less or greater extent, depending on which one it is, they are sort of connected nationally. NYPIRG we certainly work with all of the other PIRGs. We work closely, for example, with our colleagues over in Vermont, but there's no official connection or institutional connection other than we have similar worldviews.
Yeah, and there are similar issues. They don't subscribe necessarily to the borders between the states.
Yeah, exactly, in terms of issues. So, for example, one of the big issues that both Vermont and New York worked on was to create something called the Climate Change Superfund Act, which is to make the world's largest oil companies at least partially responsible for the costs of climate damages. Vermont passed a bill similar to New York's in June and was approved with the acquiescence of Governor Phil Scott. And this past week in New York, the governor of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul, signed the New York version of the legislation into law. And so both of those are really ways to reduce the taxpayer burden for climate change because those costs will be enormous. In Vermont, of course, their state capital, Montpelier, has been flooded 2 years in a row. And it's, climate change is not going to get any better anytime soon. And that means more intense storms, more heat, worse air quality, and rising sea levels in New York. Not so much a big deal in Vermont, where there's going to be billions and billions of dollars in damages until these type of laws pass. The taxpayer is 100% on the hook in both states now. some of those costs, a significant portion of those costs, will be shifted to the oil companies.
Yeah, well, the issue of climate is huge, obviously. We have a bond act. We have this new law now, the Superfund Act. But the arguments from the other side that attempted to derail the signing of this legislation center around things like we don't put out the percentage of emissions that really impacts anyone. The cost will be passed on to consumers and other such arguments. And obviously, all politicians look at this under a political lens, Blair. What does this all mean in your crystal ball looking forward, for example, for Governor Kathy Hochul? Is this a good political move?
Well, I mean, New York is not Texas, so there's not a gigantic oil industry, right? I mean, our view is that it's a hugely popular. I mean, we've had some polling done which shows that that's true, that the vast majority of New Yorkers, it doesn't matter what party affiliation, believe that the polluters should pay. It shouldn't just be the cost solely borne by the taxpayer. And in fairness to the taxpayer, even though we benefited, of course, from fossil fuel-powered economy, the industry is known for decades that the burning of fossil fuels was going to heat up the planet. And if you heated up the planet, you're going to have all sorts of problems, which is exactly what's happening. And instead of telling people about it and helping to figure out, well, what do we do worldwide, they've done everything they can, and they still do, to block measures to come up with a green grid, to come up with measures to shift away from the reliance on fossil fuels because they're more interested in their bottom line. And so, okay, that's the way they're going to behave. Well, let's take some of their bottom line and offset the cost to taxpayers. In New York, over the next 25 years, New York taxpayers will save $75 billion. And you're right that part of the argument was, well, won't these costs be passed on to the public? The answer is no. Economists have looked at this and concluded that since it's a worldwide commodity, you just can't shift the cost. It's not a carbon tax the way this is designed. And so the public won't. But even if they did, right now you're completely on the hook, the taxpayers, 100% of the cost. And even if the oil companies figure out some nefarious way to shift the cost, you're still on the hook for 100% of the cost. You can't be on the hook for more than 100% of the cost. And so it just, from our perspective, made sense to roll the dice, particularly when economists agreed that just by the way it's designed, the cost will not be passed on to the public. And instead of spending $150 or $200 billion on climate damages out of the taxpayer pocket, it'll be that number minus $75 billion. So we think it makes sense from a taxpayer perspective. And of course, we think it makes sense from a fairness perspective. Why should the public have to eat the entire cost of roads being washed out, tornadoes touching down, people having to endure hotter temperatures when the oil companies are fabulously profitable, and they're making profits because they are doing everything they can to make the atmosphere worse.
He is Blair Horner, now the Senior Policy Advisor at NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group, and you're listening to The Capital Connection. I'm David Gustina. Well, Blair, the thing that's hovering under the surface there in all this discussion is this lack of faith in institutions and cynicism that seem to be growing and growing and growing in reaction to people actually understanding, quote, how politics works, in that, we'll put the burden on industry and then they'll put the burden on consumers. Haven't you noticed this over your long career now? That the cynicism about politics is partly based in reality, that lawmakers often don't make decisions that directly benefit the citizens of the states in which they live.
Well, I mean, it's always been there. You can go back to the times of the founding fathers, right? They argued against having political parties because it would be divisive in the nation. And they were right. And so it's always been like this. I mean, people would fight on the floors of the Congress over slavery with essentially baseball bats to beat each other up. So it's not like we've never had this problem. But what is different, I think, and what makes it more toxic now is thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, it's basically impossible to do anything meaningful to significantly reduce the amount of spending of big money on political decision making. And that means there's now armies of consultants who have nothing better to do than to drive wedges in our society. And so that, coupled with a sort of decentralized communication system, where instead of newspapers delivering the news, even sometimes they of course have their own ideological perspective. You can now find whatever you want to find anywhere through the internet.
Absolutely.
And so our society is more divided, and people make big bucks making sure that stays that way. And so the political environment is certainly more toxic than it's been at least in the 4 decades that I've been doing this work.
Well, that's a very hopeful thought, Blair, for 2025.
Well, I mean, that's the challenge to America.
It sure
and
is.
to New York citizens. It's like, well, what do you do about it? And part of it is you got to find sources of information. You got to be educated on how the process works. You can't just assume the worst is always going to happen, because we all live in the same country. And as ridiculous as some of the things that the United States has done over its 250 years, by and large, we try to be, at least aspire to be, a force for good. And so let's remember that.
I think we also have to remember, forgive the plug here, that the way you get verified information is to support the journalism of verification, to support those news outlets that bring you the information that's verifiable, that you can trust, that you can rely on. And in this disinformation age, it seems the fewer and far between that you get those sources of information. I believe WAMC is one, and so many other great local news and other even larger institutions, including the New York Times, represent. And I think people have lost sight and think more of information as free and are less likely then, especially if they're getting it through social media, to support those institutions.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. And public radio and public media generally, you're trying to find, as an institution, as an entity, you're trying to deliver as unfiltered information as possible. And that's different than organizations or entities that are trying to divide the country. And so I think the public, particularly listeners, should agree that public radio, for example, is one of those institutions that tries to pull people together as compared to push them apart. And that's what people should be looking for, that everyone has a perspective on the world. Every sort of analysis may not match up with your understanding, the listener or the viewer's understanding of the world. But does the institution try to bring people together, or does it try to divide them? And if it tries to bring people together, you should pay more attention to them.
Well put, Blair Horner. Now, let's talk about an issue I know you're concerned about at NYPIRG, and we are in public media. Transparency. Oh, boy. New York Governor Kathy Hochul vetoed a bill that would require state agencies to post information not currently available to the public on lucrative contracts awarded to private entities. It was Hochul's second veto of the bill. The Democrat says the bill would hamper the state's ability to respond to emergencies. Well, I had the comptroller on the Capital Connection recently. He ain't too happy about it. He has other issues with transparency when it comes to contracts and other agreements, public and private partnerships in New York. Blair, I'm assuming you don't like it either.
You're right about that. I mean, New York, just so the listeners understand, New York has different elected officials than you have in most other states. So the state comptroller, for example, who's the sort of the auditor of the state, the person who's is supposed to be looking at the state's finances in addition to its pension investments, is a separately elected statewide elected official. And so there's always been a tension between the comptroller and the governor, because the governor runs the agencies that the comptroller is watching. It got most notable when Andrew Cuomo became governor, because he got laws passed that trimmed the power of the comptroller to oversee contracting. And when you don't have independent oversight of contracting, you get scandals. And that's what happened under former Governor Cuomo. Some of his top aides went to jail, for example, for gaming the system to benefit favored contractors or vendors. And so the comptroller is right that there should be as much access to information as possible. And we were very disappointed that the governor vetoed the bill. We've supported it this past year as well as in the previous year.
Well, I'd love to ask the governor about it, but I can't get her people to be transparent enough with me as to why she won't come on the program. I think that public officials like the governor, including the Attorney General, Letitia James, and others, should actually respond when you ask them to do a program and maybe feel it's their responsibility to talk openly and transparently about the decision making that's going on in their respective departments. The idea that you can't get to public officials anymore, and they have all these other ways to get their messages out. They have social media sites, and I don't see them doing much with their state websites, but certainly they have other ways, podcasts and other ways to get their message out, and then that allows them to bypass talking to public media.
Well, that's true. But again, it really is, I don't want to sound like a defender of the status quo, but that is more or less the way they've always behaved. The advantage now is you're right, they have their own channels to put information out. And prior to really the current situation with social media, they just didn't do anything. They would put out their own mailings to people. So, democracy works best when it operates in the open, and you raise the risk of corruption when you operate in secret. And Albany is known for its tradition of secrecy, and unfortunately, very little of that has changed.
You referenced that former Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo's associates went to jail over some of these contracts that weren't vetted properly, and eventually the bidding process was found to be corrupted. But if I'm remembering correctly, Blair, didn't their convictions get overturned because the Supreme Court overthrew the theft of honest services law?
Yes. The U.S. Supreme Court, much of what's going on in America in terms of sort of the rising risk of corruption in America comes from U.S. Supreme Court decisions that basically, on the one hand, have said, going back to the 70s, actually, that free speech, a function of free speech is how much money you want to spend to influence speech. And so, therefore, the wealthy speak with a megaphone, and the average person in the public is reduced to a whisper. That goes back to Buckley v. Vallejo in the mid-1970s, when laws passed to try to regulate campaign contributions after the Nixon Watergate, disgrace and scandal. They've also trimmed back the power of U.S. attorneys to prosecute federal crimes under the Theft of Honest Services Act, and that has allowed, basically quid pro quos to occur, but as long as you do it correctly. So both of those things, the unfettered spending of money to influence political speech in America, combined with a rising inability of federal enforcers to do anything about corruption, leads to more corruption. Now that doesn't replace state laws. And this is where Governor Hochul and state lawmakers are on the hook. If the feds can't do it, the state can. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for the upcoming session, at least for the next 2 years, is what do you do then to improve oversight of state agencies and encourage the public to believe that things are being done properly? Well, one of the ways is you have better oversight of contracts, which is what we were just talking about, not less oversight of contracts. And then you also have to create independent enforcement agencies. And so that, I think, is still going to be a challenge. To be fair, democracy is a work in progress. We never get it right. We're a bunch of humans. But it doesn't mean that you stop doing it. And so we're going to keep pushing for better oversight of ethics laws in New York.
He is Blair Horner, the now senior policy advisor for NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. You are listening to The Capital Connection. I'm David Gustina. Well, Blair, I want to talk to you about an issue that we spoke about before. The headline is New York Hospital Safety Rankings Among Worst Nationally. But there's a new story that just came out. I want to read you the lead for it, see if I get your reaction and maybe an update on this issue from you as well. New York State is ranked last in the nation for delivery of early intervention services, therapy for babies and toddlers with developmental delays. But advocates say things have gotten a lot worse in just the last few months after the launch of a new software system they say is making it harder for therapists to get paid and even harder for children to get therapy. Another new wrinkle, but we know about the problems with our hospitals. We saw what happened during COVID. We know there are staffing issues. We see strikes all over the place among nurses. What are you thinking?
I mean, again, I don't know anything about this report you were just referring to that you read the lead. And so just so all of the listeners know, lead is the first paragraph that's supposed to get your attention when you read an article. That's journalism jargon. LEDE, I think is the way it's spelled.
Yeah, coming from public media, not commercial
right.
media.
And so I don't feel like I'm in a place where I could actually comment specifically on a report that I haven't read. But generally speaking, there's a huge problem in the United States when it comes to the quality of care in hospitals. There's been studies that go back to the 1990s. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine did a report named "To Err is Human," and they did a big report on how hundreds of thousands of people across the country are injured or killed due to negligent care in hospitals. So it's a problem across the country. New York, which gets viewed as being the standard for the country. It's really hospital central down in Manhattan. People don't think about it in terms of the quality of care, but there's been these national rankings consistently over the last 20 years, which shows New York to be among, the bottom tier of the country in terms of hospital care. And that doesn't get addressed. And so the question really is why? And frankly, I think it's that the state agencies are not doing enough to police the healthcare system, and that has been the case. Now, it's been a slide for a long time, going really back to the Pataki administration, where the state agencies did a lot less to enforce the rules in healthcare settings than they used to under former Health Commissioner David Axelrod, who was the Health Commissioner under Mario Cuomo. There hasn't been enough innovation into how you manage it. And so when these report cards come out nationally, New York tends to do much worse, even though we may have some of the best hospitals in the world in Manhattan and downstate. Most of the rest of the state does poorly. And it's really the public is dimly aware, and I think if they knew more, they'd be clamoring for change.
Well, Blair, besides this new climate law that was signed by the governor, which I know you're very happy about, in this year past, tell me something else you're happy and positive about. And going forward, as the new senior policy advisor at NYPIRG, what is your main focus going to be coming this session?
Well, in terms of another big thing that happened in this past, let's say, session, and just so that your viewers know, I mean, listeners know, somewhere in the neighborhood of over 10,000 bills get introduced, and roughly 800 of them become law. This year, one of the big changes was in the state's tuition assistance program, which is the main engine that drives financial assistance to college students. The state modernized the ranking, the way that they evaluated income for the first time in 20 years. And so the maximum family income until this year that families that wish to qualify for financial assistance to the TAP program was $80,000, and they raised it to $125,000, which basically just adjusts for inflation. It's been $80,000 for 20 years, and then they raised the minimum award from $500 to $1,000, which is again had been in place for 20 years. And so those were, I think, significant changes, and those are important changes, keeping college more affordable. No matter what people think about colleges and universities, for most people, the ladder to success in society is to get more credentials. And even though most people don't get a college degree, for the people that do, the studies tell you that they make more money and they're more involved in civic life. And so that's a big change, and that is a good thing. Looking forward, I think that the challenges the state is going to face that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to is dealing with, again, the sort of what do you do about climate? That's not going away. And what can society do in New York to show the country how to deal with the climate catastrophe we're living in? I mean, the federal government isn't going to do anything. The new president says it's a hoax. That means nothing's going to happen that's good out of the Congress. And so if a state like New York doesn't show the country what to do, who will? And so I think the challenge in how you tackle those problems, and it's a myriad of problems, the one that we're sort of in the laboratory helping to develop is how do you make it so that existing buildings are more energy efficient And how do you provide financing for that to happen so that existing buildings don't rely on fossil fuel and they're more energy efficient, which, by the way, makes your bill cheaper. So that's going to be one of the big ones. There's going to be more challenges in terms of higher education as well. There are colleges that have closed recently, mainly private colleges, because the state has been whittling back its overall support. We think that system has to change too. And as I mentioned, of course, the ongoing Sisyphean struggle to improve the state's ethics laws writ large.
So many things we didn't get to. We will get to them again with Blair Horner. And a big congratulations, now Senior Policy Advisor at NYPIRG, the New York Public Interest Research Group. And if you want to do something to help change in the new year, go to nypirg.org and sign up for an environmental job. You got applications there, right, Blair?
Yes, of course. We'll put everybody to work. There's a lot of work to do.
Blair Horner with us on the Capital Connection this week. Happy New Year to all. And Blair, we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year to everyone.
Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Gustina.